It is good to be with you guys. I want to thank Trevor for his prayer. I don't know if you were hearing the way he prayed or what he prayed for, that he was asking for the songs we sing to change us. He was asking for the discussion of God's word to impact our lives. And it made me, as I listened to his prayer, think about the idea of how easy it is for our worship of God, for our practice in seeking to serve Him, to become ritual without meaning. There is nothing wrong with ritual. God often has many rituals throughout the history of His people, but He always had a reason for the ritual. He had a meaning behind it. There was something the ritual was intended to accomplish. And that is a question for us to ponder as we gather today and every time we gather. So we have these rituals of worship and the Lord's Supper and praying. But is it simply ritual, or is it making a difference in my life because God intended it to? And that relates to our topic this morning. I had Trice read the first 23 verses because it's been almost a month since I preached. Because of getting used to having baby Sophia around. So I appreciate Trevor covering all of that. And we're in the section, we're looking at the identity of Christ, with the big theme of Colossians being that Paul wants the Colossians to be filled with the knowledge of God's will. And if you remember the last lessons where I had him read that section, he wanted that so that they could walk worthy, so they could bear good fruit, so they could know God, so they could give thanks to God, so they could be strengthened by God's power. That this was God's desire and intention and will for His people. He wants them to understand Him through His will. And the reason I said that the way Trevor prayed today relates to the lesson is because it's very easy for us to know who Jesus is when we read the Gospels. We come to understand who He is. We come to comprehend His nature, His character, what He says. But does it impact us? Does it make a difference in our lives? Does it change the way we see the world? Does it change the way we interact with the world? Because it's supposed to. It's very easy for the identity of Jesus to be merely an intellectual practice. We say, yes, He is this, and yes, He is this, and yes, He is this, and yes, He is this. But does it matter to us personally and also to the people we interact with? Is it ritual, or is it ritual with meaning? And so I wanted to cover all of the rest of chapter 1 today, but I didn't want to rush through this section where Paul spends a lot of time talking about pieces of Jesus' identity. And because one of our goals in doing Colossians is to understand the identity of Jesus, I want us to take time to work through this and consider and mull over what it is these things tell us about Him. So in this section, if you look at verses 19 and 20, verses 19 and 20, there's two things Paul tells us about God's will. Remember, the kind of big theme of Colossians is being fully assured in the will of God. And so in verses 19 and 20, he says that, one, it was God's good pleasure. It's another way to say this was God's desire. This was His will. It was God's good pleasure for the fullness to dwell in Jesus. Now, what that is what we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about today. What is this fullness? But he also says in verse 20, it was also His good pleasure to have Jesus reconcile all things to Himself through the blood of His cross. So we'll spend less time on that point because I really want to spend a lot of time on this first point about asking what is all the fullness and why does it matter? How should it change? What impact should that have on me? And the answer is verses 15 through 18. He starts off by saying He is the firstborn from the dead. Sorry, firstborn of creation, the last part. Firstborn of creation. He says He is the image of the invisible God. So just right off the bat, if you are thinking about that, Paul's 5 goals of knowing God's will, this one definitely relates to knowing God, that we know God through His will. And so that's not saying that it doesn't relate to any of the other 5 things in the previous paragraph, but it definitely relates to that one. That'll be our focal point this morning in this section. So he's the firstborn of creation. He is before all things. He is the one in whom all things hold together. He is the head of the body, and he is the firstborn from the dead. Now, if you feel confused, I felt confused as well when studying this text, trying to understand what do these things mean? What is Paul saying about Jesus, and why does it matter? But you also might notice that the first line and the last line are pretty similar. He's the firstborn of creation versus he's the firstborn of the dead. There seems to be some kind of contrasting parallelism there. And in fact, I will suggest to you that there is a chiasm where the center part is the main point. Think of an archway. The keystone is what holds it all together. And in this case, it's literally the phrase in the center that all things are held together in Jesus. And just on the other sides of that, he's before all things, and he's the head of the body. And he's on the outside, he's the firstborn of creation and also the firstborn of the dead. So what does this tell us about Jesus? What does this actually mean? Why should it actually matter? Well, looking at the first phrase, and we'll take them in these pairs. So we'll do the first and last one, the second and the fourth one, and then the middle one, as that's the center part. One of the things that Paul does, and one of the parallels to see is with that first and last one, he actually gives a reason. And the reason he gives here is he's firstborn of creation because he created everything. Now, with a title like firstborn of creation, it's understandable to ask, well, does this maybe mean that Jesus was created, that he's the first created thing? And that's an understandable question. But you could make the argument from this text, but it'll be a little bit shorter if we just highlight John 1, verse 3, in the introduction and talking about Jesus. John makes a very plain statement that answers that question. Was Jesus created? In verse 3 of the Gospel of John, he says, all things came into being through him. Same thing that Paul's saying here, that everything was created by Jesus. Apart from him, not even one thing came into being that has come into being. In other words, saying anything that began to exist, Jesus caused it to begin to exist. And if that is the case, Jesus must be eternal. He is part of the Godhead. He was not created. So he's not firstborn of creation because he's the first created thing. Paul says he's the firstborn because he created everything. And let's just ponder that, because Paul gives some clarification pictures here. He lists 4 things: thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities. And we might know what those words mean, but let's make it more down to earth, but more colloquial. So every kingdom that has ever existed, every nation that has ever existed, Jesus had a hand in bringing it into existence. There's no king or governor or president that has ever ruled that Jesus did not give him his dominion and territory. That's true in the physical realm. It's true in the spiritual realm. In Ephesians, it talks about powers and authorities and principalities in the heavenly places. I don't know if there's thrones in the heavens amongst the angels, but if there are, Jesus made them. All kingdoms that have ever existed, he has created. I use the word realms to emphasize places, and connecting it to the idea of dominions. If there is a place that's ever been created, Jesus made it. So every place in our world, in our universe, any spiritual place that has been created, Jesus made it. He created hell. The language of Matthew 25, the hell was made for the devil and his angels. If it's made, if it's created, Jesus made it. Every being, everything from every human you will ever meet to all the cherubim and the angels that have been created, Jesus has made them. Every force. I don't know if there are parallel spiritual forces like gravity and the laws of nature, if there are spiritual laws of nature that exist out there that have been created. But if there are, Jesus made them. And so why does this matter? Because all of these things are not just made by Jesus, but for him. I don't know about you, but when I read that, I not this time because I've noticed this before, but when I first noticed that, and language like that, Colossians is not the only place you see this, it bothered me a little bit. Because this claim is that Jesus created us and everything not for our sakes, not for our benefit, but for his. And that kind of makes Jesus and the Father seem a little egotistical, selfish, arrogant. And yet, why do I feel that way? Because of my ego and my pride and my arrogance. If I didn't have those things, it wouldn't bother me at all that God maybe made me and this world for his purposes and for himself. But let's relate this to our life. When we don't create to the same degree God does. God can take nothing and create something. We can't do that. But we can create in a far lesser degree. We create art. Well, why do we create art? For our sakes. Why do we make food? For our sakes. We take wood and we structure them into dwellings. Why? For our sakes. We don't ask the wood if it wants to be a house. We don't ask the food if it wants to be eaten. All the things we create for the same purpose, for ourselves, just like Jesus did. And so part of recognizing this identity of Jesus is, do I accept that about my King? That he is creator of all things. If it's been created, he created it for himself. In addition to being creator, and that's partially what makes him firstborn of creation, and that they're made for him, I would also suggest that the reason that Jesus is given this designation in contrast to the Father or the Spirit is that even though everything that has been brought into creation he's had hand in, he is the only one of the three that dwelt literally amongst the creation. Here's an interesting thought. Apparently, Jesus would have had a hand in crafting the body he would then inhabit as the human Jesus. I don't know if he's called Jesus before he becomes a human. Might just be called the Son at that point. But I would suggest that he gets this title because, unlike the experience of the Father and the experience of the Spirit, he experiences creation. He experiences what it's like to become the thing that he has created. The incarnation of God in the flesh. And so he is firstborn in that sense. And that's going to be really important in a minute. So jumping to the idea of being firstborn from the dead. He says he's firstborn from the dead in the sense that he is the first one to be truly resurrected. There are people in the Old Testament who die and are brought back to life. There are people in Jesus' ministry before he dies who he brings back to life. But every other person who has been brought back to life always dies again. That was true of all the people Jesus raised from the dead. That's true from all the prophets of the Old Testament who raised from the dead. And it's true of the people the apostles raised from the dead. Jesus is the first person to be resurrected to not die again. As the language of Acts 2 says, death could not hold him. It had no claim over him. And so he's the firstborn from the dead, because he's the first to be truly resurrected, a resurrection that foreshadows what one day we will experience. We be brought back to life, brought back from the dead, to not die again. But he gives a reason for this. He says, so that he will have first place in everything. That part of the goal God has here in this plan is for people to recognize his preeminence, to recognize his position, to recognize that he is the first and rightfully deserves that position. Now, looking at these two ideas, being the firstborn of creation, the firstborn from the dead, I think the true parallel here and the true big point is that Jesus is the first true human. And the next sermon that I do, we're going to spend a lot more time thinking about this idea. So just, you have to hold on to this thought. But when God makes Adam and Eve, they are in perfect relationship with him. They know the Creator. They are known by their Creator. They walk with him in the garden. But then they sin. They rebel. They transgress the Creator. And as a result, there's a chasm that is created between Creator and created. God knew that would happen. He knew he would send Jesus. He knew all of that. But that's not what he wanted to happen. He didn't want mankind to sin. He doesn't want us to transgress his law. That was not his vision for humanity. His vision was for humanity to be in the image of him. And Jesus is the first human to ever actually be that. He's the first human to ever fully represent what God had planned for humanity. The first one of creation because he is fully human. We often don't think of those terms, but if God is our creator, he is the one who gives us our design, our purpose, our meaning. Jesus is the one who first and foremost fulfills all of that. He's the one who never loses his relationship to the Father, who never abandons the call to follow the Creator. He's the first true human. And is the example for us. And in addition, as he says at the very beginning of verse 15, he is the image of the invisible God. So even though the Father is not the one who comes and lives as a person, it is the Son. That shows us that if the Father did, he would be Jesus. It's the very thing Jesus tells Thomas when he says, the night he's going to be betrayed, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Are we seeking to imitate the first true human? Are we living our lives based on his example and pattern and his devotion and ambition? Because if we want to be fully human, here's the model. Being first in everything also points to our next major point, being before all things. Now, of course, there is an obvious sense where this must be true. If Jesus created everything, of course he has to exist to cause everything to come into existence. So, of course, in a causal or temporal sense, of course he's before all things. I don't think that's the point Paul's making. It's so obvious that he's probably making a different point. I think he's making the point that Jesus' supremacy, his preeminence, is above all creation. Another way to say this is Jesus did not and probably could not create anything greater than himself. He absolutely couldn't create an eternal being in the sense that they've never had a beginning. It's literally a self-contradiction of thought. If you're eternal, you're uncreated. If you're created, you're not eternal. You can exist forever from that point, but you can't have always existed and be created. So at the very least, it's obvious that he can't create an eternal being like himself. He can create a being that will have no end, but have a beginning. Here's the impact of this thought. As people, we make sacrifices for people and beings and things and causes that are important. We sacrifice for our family, our children. We sacrifice for complete strangers. Firefighters run into burning buildings all the time to save people they don't know because they're human and they're valuable and they're important. People sacrifice their lives for their countries. Paul's statement here says Jesus is the most important thing. What are you and I willing to sacrifice for that? We make great sacrifices for all these other truly important things, our families and people and the world. What are we willing to sacrifice for the one who is truly the most important one? Who is before all things? if we're willing to make great sacrifices for these important but lesser things, how much more should we be willing to sacrifice for Jesus, the one who's before all things, the most important one? And that flows right into that fourth point about him being the head. He's the head of the body, and he defines what he means. He's talking about the church, the group of the saved, not just a local assembly. He is in charge of those. Revelation makes that clear. But of the individuals who make up the one group of the saved. That he is the one who doesn't just tell us how we ought to worship. He tells us that. Doesn't just tell us how congregations ought to be organized. He tells us that. But the one who tells us about every piece of our lives. That everything I do, everything I say is under his authority. That the way this is pictured in the Bible, of him being the head and the body being made of Christians, I've made this point before, but to me it's such a powerful analogy. When your hand, or you have an organ, or you have a limb that does not listen to the head, how do we describe that? You're sick. You're sick and you need to be healed. You need medicine, you need treatment, you need to eat better food so that you will stop being sick. Is it true in my life that Jesus is my head? Does he have total authority over everything I do? Is he the one who helps me decide what kind of job I will or will not take? Is he the one who helps me kind of decide what hobbies I will or will not have? Is he the one who decides what kind of person I will or will not marry, what kind of parent I am or I am not? Growing up, and I don't think this was intentional, I think what often happened, people really stressed the authority of Jesus inside the worship assembly, inside church structure, and that does matter. Happy to talk about that whenever you want, because it does matter. It's important. But the New Testament picture is he doesn't just control what happens on Sundays or Wednesdays or what happens inside a church, a building owned by a local congregation. He does have that authority. I'm not taking that away from him. But it extends far beyond that. That every part of my life is to be under the total authority of Jesus. So, the kinds of hobbies I choose, I should be willing to stand up and say, I think Jesus would choose these hobbies. And this amount of time he'd give to them. And this is the kind of job he'd be okay with me having this job. And he'd be okay me marrying this person. That every choice I make, growing up, I had this false separation between my secular life and my religious life. Because there were things that I did with Christians or did in church buildings that were not the same as I did outside. And I'm not saying that those things have no bearing. What I'm saying is the false separation to say that one is secular and one is religious. My whole life is religious. My whole life belongs to the King. My whole life is under his authority. Do I act that way? The identity of Jesus matters. It will change our life if we let it. This is the fullness that Paul is describing. It was God's will for the fullness to dwell in Jesus. And for all of that to hold together. This has been the hardest idea for me to wrap my head around, in the sense that I feel like I have the whole picture, and I don't think I do. I think there's probably implications of Paul's statement here that I've not connected to yet. And so please feel free to talk to me about this afterwards, about ideas and connections you see that I don't bring up. But some of the things that jump out to me when Paul says this is that apparently creation could not continue to exist without the Creator. Now, that's very different than my intuitive sense. When I think of the Creator, I think of him creating something that's separate in a kind of totality sense. That he creates this, it's apart from him, it's his creation, he owns it, he has rightful control over it, but its existence is kind of disconnected from the Creator. And what this text says is apparently that's not how it works. That when God creates, when Jesus creates, If somehow, again, it's a contradiction to eternality, but if he could poof out of existence, so would the things he created. That his existence is a necessary piece for the continued creation to exist. And that includes the spiritual realities. So it's not just that the physical world, the physical universe, or physical bodies would prove to exist. The ideas of morality, of purpose, of meaning, of value would cease to exist. Here's what I mean by that. What makes a person go crazy? What makes a person fall into despair? What makes a person give up on life? When it doesn't make sense. When they can't explain what's going on, they can't rationalize why the suffering and the hardship is happening to them or people they love. And when they look at the story of life and it's irrational and unreasonable, they give up and they go insane. And it's because God created us in such a way that the way we interpret the world is just in story form. Where have we come from? Where are we? Where are we going? Questions of identity and purpose and value are story questions. And what he's saying here is the story of existence and the story of mankind and the story of the universe only makes sense and only holds together and only exists in the Creator. If you try to make sense of the world without Jesus, you will fail. If you try to find meaning and value and purpose in the world, it will be a shadow of the reality. Because reality can only exist, spiritual reality can only exist if it's held together in Him. So whatever purpose you want to define for yourself, whatever identity you want to define for yourself, whatever meaning and value to life you want to define for yourself, will be a vapor. Because it's not connected to Jesus. You want meaning and value and purpose and identity, those only exist when you're connected to the Creator. Because no created thing can continue its existence without the Creator. Do I live that way? When you realize that it's all wrapped up, suddenly my identity is wrapped up in the Creator, and without the Creator, I don't really have an identity, then it makes sense to make every sacrifice for Him. And it makes sense for Him to be my head and submit to His authority totally. It makes sense to make my story His story. To follow the example of the firstborn of creation and the firstborn of the dead and model my life after Him. It all holds together in Him. And it was God's will for this to be the case. And this knowledge is supposed to change us. At the very least, to know God's desire. God's story for humanity was not one of death and destruction. It was one of life and abundance. And Jesus is the model of that. He's also the sacrifice that makes that reality possible. Will I let that change how I live? The second thing that Paul highlights in verse 20, that it was God's desire, His good pleasure to have Jesus reconcile all things to Himself. And that's an interesting thing. I think we often think of being at odds with the Father in bad relationship with the Father, and not realize that also is true of Jesus. That Jesus had to reconcile us not just to the Father, He had to do that, or to the Spirit, had to do that, but to Himself. And He became the sacrifice for us. It was His blood on the cross that made that possible. And so he says in verse 21, you were alienated, hostile, and engaged in evil deeds. I just want to spend a few seconds thinking about those ideas. All of us have a biological father and mother. But they didn't create us. The one being that truly chose us to come into existence was the Father in Jesus. Your parents wanted you. They love you desperately. But they didn't think you up. They're simply recipients of the gift from God. God thought you up and wanted you to exist. In your family, at this point in time, in this world, which means when God created you, you had a home with Him. You belonged with Him. You had a proper relationship with Him. But all of us, as Romans 3 says, rejected that home. We ran away, and as a result, had to be banished from our home. And when we try to come back to the home on our own merits and our own will, we're not home in a home. We're aliens. You didn't have a place you belonged. It all holds together in Jesus. You were hostile. We really want there to be this neutral ground between following Jesus and not following Jesus. But the Bible says there isn't. Even if we don't mean to be. The Bible acknowledges ignorance. But being ignorant of the will of God and the will of the King Jesus doesn't change the fact that when I'm ignorant of it, I'm an enemy of Jesus. I'm an enemy of His purposes. I'm an enemy of His ambitions. I'm fighting for Satan's army, even if I'm not meaning to. That's what I'm doing. He says, you were hostile. It's the language of Romans 5:10, where he says, when you were an enemy of Christ, He died for you. The King gave His life to redeem the enemy army. This is where you were. This is where He's reconciling you. You were aliens, and He had to reconcile you. You were hostile. He had to reconcile you. And you were engaged in evil deeds. I know for myself, growing up, I grew up on the pews, grew up reading the Bible. I think I had to be at least in my mid-20s, maybe a little bit earlier than that, but in my 20s, before I recognized, or maybe acknowledged, that the Bible frequently talks to Christians and says, you guys were evil. Evil is a word we reserve for the really bad people, the really bad things, not ourselves. But the Bible doesn't make that distinction. He doesn't talk about the really bad people and the kind of bad people. He doesn't talk about the people who do evil and the people who make bad choices, the people who do wrong, the people who make mistakes. They are those. But God calls them evil. If you've never stopped to think about what in your past life would God call evil, I encourage you to do that. Because I can promise you there's something there. There are certain things, certain ways I treated my brother that I look back now and say, that was evil. At the moment, I didn't feel that way, but it was. Now, here's the beauty of this. This is really sobering thoughts. You were aliens, you were hostile, you were engaged in evil deeds, because here's the beauty. He is contrasting where they are now. He says, this is what you were. This was true of you. It's not true of you now because of the reconciling work of Jesus. This is what Jesus is doing in your life. You're holy, you're blameless, you're beyond reproach. Notice the parallel here. You were set apart away from Jesus and as an alien, but now you are set apart for Jesus. You're in relationship with the Holy Creator. You've been made special, sanctified for that. You were hostile. You're an enemy, but now you're an ally of the throne. You've been won out of the enemy army, and so now you stand blameless despite all the blame you have in your past. Similar, he says, you committed evil deeds, but now you are beyond reproach. That's probably the most bold and brash statement here, in my opinion, because literally, to be reproachable means it's worthy of rebuke and correction. It's the definition of committing evil deeds. Evil deeds are reproachable by definition, and yet he says, because of the reconciling work of Jesus in your life, you are beyond that reproach. Why is that? It's not like Jesus magically rewrites history and suddenly the things we did that were evil are no longer in the annals of history. No, we don't change that. but he covers them. It's like they're forgotten in the eyes of God. That if I'm in Christ, if I am a Christian, he sees me, and he doesn't see all of the evil I have committed. He sees a being beyond reproach because of the sacrifice of Jesus and the reconciling work of Jesus. That's amazing. Now, the reason this all matters, what it's supposed to do, this knowledge of God's will here, is supposed to help us feel strengthened for the challenges in our walk with the King. I know that because, again, that's the line from verse 11 and the previous paragraph. That's one of the goals he has, to be strengthened in all glorious might for the attaining of perseverance and patience, the longer form, abbreviated here. But if you notice what he says in 22 and 23, he says, this is all true if you continue in faith. If you stay firmly established and steadfast. If you keep holding to the hope, the confident expectation of the gospel you heard. He's giving us this knowledge of God's will to reconcile us to Jesus and to the Father, because he wants it to give us strength and courage and endurance. It's the same kind of language as that perseverance and patience. He says following Jesus is hard. It takes sacrifice. It's not easy. But he gives it, and he's done this so that you will feel encouraged and empowered to do so. Because this is where you were. But this is where Jesus is taking you. This is how he's changing your life. The identity of Jesus matters. And it matters even more than these points. We're going to have to wait for the next sermon to hear about that. The question I'll leave us with this morning is, will we let it change us? Will we let this information, will we let this knowledge of God's will cause us to know and love God more, and cause us to grow in perseverance and patience as we continue in faith? It is my prayer that every time we come together, our ritual has meaning. That we walk out different people than we came in that day. We walk out loving God more. We walk out loving each other more. We walk out more knowledgeable of the Creator. We walk out ready to be better lights in the world, better equipped to be lights in the world. And if that's not happening, we need to be talking about how do we make that happen. Because God's vision of his people is not just people who observe ritual, but who observe the ritual and are changed by it. Who come to know Jesus and are changed by that knowledge. And if there's any specific way we can help you do that today, we want to know. So if you have any spiritual need, let us know as we stand.